Welcome to our Culture Matters presentation, Counseling LGBTQ+ Athletes by Whitney Miller, Mara Smith, and Tom Pignone. So we just want to provide a very quick outline, as you'll see here, for our presentation in terms of providing an introduction and background, a summary of the article, an analysis or implications for practice, and then also our discussion questions.
LGBTQ is an acronym for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and the Q may either stand for queer or questioning. All of these are used to describe a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. Q+ is inclusive to all other orientations and identities. I have several other of these identities on this slide, but the spectrum is absolutely not limited to these terms alone. It's important to keep in mind that within the spectrum, things are always changing and evolving, so it's important for clinicians to always be willing to educate themselves on new terms. It's also important that we always ask our clients how they prefer to identify. Things to consider when working with this group is that LGBTQ people are more likely to have a mental health diagnosis compared to their heterosexual counterparts. Minority stress theory gives insight as to why this is and asserts that chronic stress associated with societal stigma, including living in a heteronormative society, depletes an individual's coping resources and results in poor mental health outcomes. They're also more likely to experience higher rates of discrimination and victimization, and they're more likely to develop internalized minority stressors. So individuals may internalize homonegativity or transnegativity from the dominant society, which results in feelings of shame related to their own sexual orientation or gender identity. These individuals may also engage in behavioral efforts to conceal their sexual orientation or identity, which also can contribute to poor mental health. Despite these challenges they face, many LGBTQ+ clients show resilience in the face of adversity and effectively use such strategies as a way to maintain hope and seek social support. They also have the strength of being able to belong to a supportive community. They're able to create families of choice when they're often maybe ostracized from their own families. They're able to serve as positive role models, live authentically. There's also room for involvement in social justice and activism, and freedom from gender-specific roles. Although individuals are at risk for poor mental health, they may not seek psychological treatment for fear of violence and discrimination, as well as concern about disclosing one's sexual orientation or gender identity. Perceptions that therapists may be unaware of minority stress and LGBT-specific issues have also created a barrier for seeking services. There is evidence that legitimizes these perceptions on the next slide. If therapists are unaware of their bias, they are more likely to engage in practices that negatively affect therapy outcomes, which include assuming that a client is heterosexual and not asking how they identify, which makes it harder for them to bring up issues around sexual orientation in the future, believing that same-sex orientation is sinful or a form of mental illness, failing to understand minority stress and the emotional problems that may result from experiences with discrimination, focusing on sexual orientation when it's not in fact relevant, attempting to have a client renounce or change their sexual orientation, lacking an understanding of identity development and not taking into account the complexity of sexual orientation and gender identity. These clinicians may view homosexuality solely as a sexual activity, not understanding the impact of possible negative societal pressures or homophobia or transphobia on identity development, underestimating the consequences of coming out for the client. It's also important to take into account intersectional identities related to coming out. For example, coming out may be more difficult for ethnic minorities than for white individuals. Misunderstanding the importance of intimate relationships, presuming that clients with a different sexual orientation cannot be good parents, and automatically assuming that their children's problems are a result of their sexual orientation. Clinicians may also over-identify with LGBTQ clients, offering excessive displays of acceptance or understanding. From here, Tom is going to present an article that can assist in guiding practice with these individuals.
So the article we decided to present on is one from Astramovich and Scott called Intersectional Advocacy with LGBTQ+ Clients in Counseling. And the authors basically presented that until recently, establishing competencies for professionals who work with these clients had not fully accounted for sort of the intersectional identities and challenges other than the identities of one's affectional orientation and gender identity. So what they did was propose a four-stage framework, counseling framework to address these things, which I will talk about on the next slide. So I wanted to share the 4 stages of the intersectional advocacy counseling framework. The first one deals with counselor reflection and self-awareness. And there are 2 ways that the authors kind of present doing this. One is they pose a number of reflection questions that tie really to the counselor's own intersecting identities and how those kind of tie to a specific worldview. And then with that, one, how much knowledge do they have about working with this particular client population, for instance? Maybe what assumptions, what beliefs do they have, how comfortable they are working with this particular population. And then the other piece here is this visual representation over on the side here. If you'll notice, what this represents are the intersecting identities of not only the client, but also the counselor as well. And they operate on 2 different continuums here. One is sort of this privileged versus marginalized identities. And then the other is whether those identities are private or public. If you notice, as you're looking here, the purple circles represent the counselor's identities, and the ones in gold represent the client's identities. You'll start to see, by seeing this visualization, you might start to see how, how these identities might demonstrate different experiences, and then also how these things might also impact, the counseling relationship as well. And in understanding that, as a counselor, I may be coming from a more privileged perspective than my clients. Now, the assumption is if we can become more comfortable and have a better understanding of where we stand relative to our clients, that we hopefully will become more comfortable in broaching some of these intersecting identities with the client within our work together. And so, that really just ties to having that open dialogue, and also understanding that the client may not be willing or maybe a little bit apprehensive about talking about these things, but I think if anything about sort of our readiness to be able to broach some of those things with them. The third one really talks about assessing advocacy readiness and facilitating advocacy skills. So again, the authors pose a good number of questions in terms of assessing advocacy readiness of our clients. And some of those questions might tie to, whether they may be prepared, maybe for example, to come out to a family member or friend, or, whether they're prepared to seek out different kinds of relationships within their community, for instance. So again, are they ready to do those things? And then, the second part is facilitating some of those advocacy skills. Some of that stuff may be more internal in terms of helping them affirm or disaffirm certain thoughts about their own identities. But then other things may be more specific about how they can go about communicating these things to others. And then the last piece ties to sort of the ongoing evaluation of those interventions. How are these things going, right? So having that discussion about progress towards goals. And then it could also be, over the course of time, also discussing dynamics within the relationship as well.
Thanks, Tom, for that great summary of the intersectional advocacy framework. Back in 2012, Griffin said that change advocates working in sport do see that things are getting better. There are increased number of LGBTQ athletes disclosing their sexual orientation at younger ages. There's increased awareness of LGBTQ issues by coaches and staff. There are organizations that focus on LGBTQ equality, such as You Can Play. And there are NGBs and sport organizations that are developing LGBTQ inclusive policies. but we really recognize that there's an opportunity for us to do more. And one of the ways we see that being possible is to utilize both an intersectional advocacy framework as well as a multi-level model of LGBTQ athlete experience so that we can understand better and help create better systems of listening, understanding, connecting, and progressing. Cunningham's multi-level model of LGBT athlete experience in sport helps us understand the different influences at different levels that do affect the athlete experience. At the macro level, which operates at a societal level, it's about large institutional activities and practices that influence the opportunities and experience of this group of athletes. They include laws, governing structures, and institutionalized norms. At the meso level, which operates at an organizational or group level, we also see ways in which influence and experience of LGBT athletes is affected. This includes the behaviors of leaders, the organizational culture, and the educational and programming opportunities within the team. It also includes allies. At the micro level, which operates at the individual level, it includes the LGBT status of the individual, their personal identity, as well as the demographics which they're surrounded by. It's very important to remember that in any multi-level theory, levels are embedded and influence one another, and none exist in isolation. Leja's words are incredibly powerful. They say, so many of us have had to overcome being told to hide who we are by people we loved and respected. LGBTQ people are at risk for violence, harassment, and bullying. It's still difficult to navigate workplaces, religious spaces, and to find community. As a queer, non-binary Black person, Clarendon knows firsthand why activists must prioritize intersectionality. If we want to be activists, social justice-oriented, good allies, or even just good people, we must make sure we approach the work through an intersectional lens. It's why we have to show up for each other, and especially for the folks who live on the margins of society. Using an intersectionality counseling framework, as well as understanding the multi-level model of LGBT athlete experience, can help us gain a wider and deeper understanding of this group. But what can we do? How can we get better? We believe that we can consistently model inclusive behavior. We can work to create welcoming and open culture. We need to commit to LGBTQ-focused training. We need to provide counseling services that support LGBTQ people with a staff that knows and understands this particular athlete group needs and experiences. We must support and make accessible resources for athletes in process of acknowledging and disclosing their sexual identity. We need training and education, which benefits athletes, coaches, and staff. And we as SEP professionals can mentor team leaders to model inclusive behaviors. We need to continue to be curious in this space in order to see problems and be creative problem solvers. The best place to start that is by asking good questions. Tom has some teed up for us to consider.
So the first three discussion questions you'll see here come directly from the Astramovich and Scott article. And then the fourth discussion question actually ties to the multi-level model that Mara had presented earlier on. This concludes our presentation. We want to thank everyone for watching, and we will leave you with our references.